Pontius Pilate, once governor of Judea, had been cast into exile. His name, once spoken in the halls of Caesar's palace, was now only whispered in the shadows. Rome had not condemned him to death. It had condemned him to be forgotten. A lonely villa in the mountains of Gaul became his prison. No soldiers watched him. No chains bound him. Yet, he was more trapped than he had ever been. He had sentenced thousands. He had ruled over men. But there was one man he could not silence. One name that would not die. Jesus of Nazareth. The name followed him, even in exile. The whispers reached him through merchants, through travelers. They did not speak of a dead man. They spoke of a king who had risen. At night, Pilate lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting. For what? He did not know. But deep in his soul, he felt it approaching. Something had begun the day he washed his hands, and no river, no exile, would cleanse him of it. Pilate no longer trusted the silence. By day, he wandered the cliffs of Gaul, trying to forget the past. By night, the past came to him. At first, it was small things, a shadow where there was none, the flicker of a torch without wind, the sensation that someone was watching him. Then, the whispers came. At first, he thought it was the servants speaking in hushed tones, but when he called for them, they had heard nothing. One evening, as a storm raged outside, a knock echoed through the villa. Pilate froze. No one knocked. The servants knew better. No messenger from Rome would come for a man who no longer existed. The knock came again. Slow. Deliberate. Pilate's chest tightened. His throat was dry. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, a voice. Low. Unshaken. Familiar. "You will see me again?" Pilate staggered back, gripping the table for support. He knew that voice. The room suddenly felt too small. The walls closed in, the air thickened. With a shaking hand, he pulled open the door. Nothing. Only the wind. Only the storm. Yet, in his bones, Pilate knew. He had not been. Pilate had hoped Rome had forgotten him. He was wrong. The messenger arrived at dawn, his cloak heavy with dust. He avoided Pilate's gaze as he handed him the scroll, its seal bearing the mark of Emperor Caligula. Pilate unrolled the parchment with unsteady hands. Pontius Pilatus, fallen governor of Judea. The Senate whispers of your failures. The name of the Galilean echoes through Rome. Even now men say he is greater than our gods. Pilate exhaled sharply. The fear had reached the heart of the empire. Tiberius is dead. Caligula reigns. And you, Pontius Pilatus, bear the stain of an execution that has shaken the world. The gods do not favor you. The empire does not need you. There will be no trial, no blade of mercy, only silence. Pilate's blood ran cold. Caligula had spoken. No soldiers would come to end him, no dagger in the night. Rome would simply erase his name. Pilate crumpled the letter in his fist. He had judged many, but now judgment had come for him. And deep within his soul, he knew. It was not the emperor he should fear. The river below the cliffs was dark and still. Pilate stood at the edge, staring at the reflection of the moon. He had come here every night for weeks, though he did not know why. The whispers had not left him. They had grown stronger. One night, unable to bear the silence, he spoke into the darkness. "What do you want?" The wind howled in response. Then the water moved. No stone had fallen, no fish had stirred. Yet ripples spread across the surface. Pilate's breath caught. The reflection shifted. A figure stood on the water. Not sinking, not struggling. Just standing. The wind stilled. The torches in the villa flickered and died. Pilate tried to move. He could not. The figure turned. And though no words were spoken, Pilate heard them all the same. "You will see me again." The voice rippled through his bones. His knees buckled. His breath came in short gasps. The figure remained motionless upon the water, its presence filling the night like a storm yet to break. Pilate blinked, and the figure was gone. But the water still rippled, and the voice still echoed in his mind. Pilate fell to his knees, his fingers clutching the damp earth. He had once stood in judgment over a man. Now he knew he was the one being judged. And there was no escape. The night was colder than before. Pilate stood at the river's edge, his cloak heavy with the weight of unspoken words. His name had been erased from Rome, his rank, his honor, gone. But the whispers had never left him. Neither had the eyes. Everywhere he turned, they followed. In the mirror, in the firelight, in the rippling surface of the water. Pilate had washed his hands before the crowd, but the stain remained. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The wind whispered his name. Pilatus. The river was waiting. Pilate took a breath, then stepped in. The water rose to his ankles, his knees, his chest. Then he saw him, standing on the shore, not bloodied, not beaten, whole, alive, watching. Pilate gasped. The same eyes, the same words. You will see me again. The river swallowed him whole, and the judgment of Pontius Pilate was complete. Pilate expected darkness, but when he opened his eyes, he was standing. The river was gone. Gaul was gone. The cold night air had vanished. No stars, no moon, only a great empty expanse stretching beyond sight. He turned. No footprints, no shadows. His body felt weightless, yet he was solid. Alive, or something like it. Where am I? He whispered. The silence did not answer. Then footsteps, distant yet approaching, slow, measured. Pilate turned, and for the first time he saw the gate. It stood alone in the void, towering, ancient, made of something that was not stone yet older than Rome itself. A voice spoke, not from the air, but from within his bones. Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea, stepped forward. Pilate's breath hitched. He had heard many voices command. Caesar, the priests, the cries of the mob. But this voice was unlike any other. It was law itself. The gate began to open. A great shadow stretched across the ground, swallowing the horizon. Pilate's heart pounded. This was no mortal court, and the true trial was about to begin. The gate yawned open. A blinding light poured forth, but it did not burn. It was not the light of fire nor the glow of the sun. It was something greater. Pilate hesitated. He had stood before Caesars and kings, but nothing had ever filled him with such dread. Then the voice spoke again. Enter. Pilate's feet moved, though he did not command them. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the world shifted. The emptiness was gone. He was in a vast hall, silent, endless. The walls were not made of stone, but of something that pulsed, like living fire. In the center of the chamber stood a throne. Pilate could not look at it directly. The figure seated there was clothed in light, radiating power beyond words. His form was neither man nor God, but something greater than both. A great scroll lay open before him. Pilate swallowed hard. He had sentenced thousands. He had judged the fate of men. But now, he was the one being judged. The figure raised a hand. The silence grew heavier, thick as stone. Then the voice, calm yet unshakable, spoke once more. Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea, you have been brought to give an account. Pilate's breath was shallow. His hands trembled. The trial had begun. The silence stretched. Pilate could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The figure on the throne slowly unrolled the scroll. The parchment gleamed, not with ink, but with burning letters that shifted like molten gold. Your deeds will be read before the court of eternity. Pilate's throat tightened. The hall had no walls, yet suddenly he was not alone. Spectres formed in the air, rising like mist, their faces familiar. Men and women he had condemned. He saw the thieves he had sentenced to crucifixion, the rebels he had ordered executed. Their eyes bore into him. Then a new figure emerged. Pilate's breath caught. Claudia, his wife. Her face was pale with sorrow, her eyes filled with a warning that had come too late. Then the voice shook the heavens. Pontius Pilatus, let your record be known. The scroll burned brighter. The words of his life appeared. Every choice, every sentence, every drop of blood spilled by his command. Pilate wanted to turn away, but he could not. The scroll would not stop. Then suddenly, a new name appeared. Jesus of Nazareth. Pilate staggered back. The letters shone like fire. And as his name was spoken, the weight of his judgment descended upon him. The hall shifted. Pilate's breath was ragged. His name burned on the scroll. Jesus of Nazareth. And suddenly, the voices began. I was a thief, hanging beside him, one voice whispered. I begged him to remember me. He did. Another, colder, sharper. I was the centurion. I drove the nails into his hands. I saw the sky turn black. I saw the earth tremble, and I knew he was innocent. More voices, rising like a tide, surrounding him, bearing witness. I was the woman healed by his touch. I was blind, and he gave me sight. I was dead, and he called me from the grave. Pilate stumbled backward. The air was heavy, pressing down. The weight of 1,000 lives, 1,000 choices, all converging upon him. But then, a final voice. It was not like the others. It did not rage. It did not tremble. It was calm. I was the high priest. Pilate's stomach twisted. Caiaphas stepped forward, his spectral form flickering like dying embers. You tried to wash your hands, Pilatus, he said. But you and I both know, water cannot cleanse what was done that day. The scroll burned brighter. Pilate could feel the weight of their eyes. Then, a silence, heavy, crushing, like the moment before a storm, and then the voice from the throne spoke once more. Bring forth the final witness. Pilate stiffened, because he already knew who it would be. And this was the moment he feared the most. A cold wind swept through the hall. Pilate could not breathe. The throne loomed before him, the scroll still burning, the voices still echoing. Then, the final witness stepped forward. The Nazarene. Jesus. Pilate's vision blurred. His chest tightened. Everything around him dimmed. And yet, he could see the eyes. The same eyes that had watched him in the Praetorium. The same eyes that had stood silent before Rome's judgment. But now Pilate was the one on trial. The hall fell into an unnatural silence. Even the spirits dared not speak. Jesus took one step forward. Pilate wanted to run, he wanted to turn away, but he could not move. The weight of those eyes held him still. They were not angry, not filled with vengeance, not burning with the fury of the heavens. They were something worse. They were knowing. Pilate's mouth was dry. His mind raced for words. A defense, an excuse, anything. But nothing came. The weight of the Nazarene's gaze held him still. What do you have to say for yourself? The voice from the throne rumbled through eternity. Pilate's lips parted, a tremor in his breath. I had no choice. The words sounded hollow, weak. The throne remained silent. Pilate swallowed hard. I tried to save him. The crowd. He stopped. Even he did not believe his own words. The moment played before his eyes, the Praetorium, the crowd's deafening roar. Crucify him. Crucify him. The basin of water, the illusion of absolution, the sign above the cross, Jesus of Nazareth. King of the Jews. His choice, his sentence. Pilate's breath grew shallow. His knees trembled. The throne did not move. The Nazarene did not speak. No anger, no hatred, only the unbearable weight of knowing. Pilate gripped his chest. The silence was worse than any curse. The spirits in the hall watched, waiting, and then the scroll burned brighter. The words inscribed upon it shifted. New letters etched themselves into eternity. Pilate's final judgment was being written, and this time, he was not the one holding the pen. The scroll burned before him. Pilate's chest tightened as the letters shifted, etched by unseen hands. A name glowed brighter than the rest. Jesus of Nazareth. Pilate's breath caught. His pulse pounded. The air around him grew heavier. I only did what Rome demanded, he whispered. The words felt thin, useless, like dust in the wind. Then the scroll turned. A new inscription appeared. I am innocent of this man's blood. Pilate's own words, the words he had spoken before the crowd, before he washed his hands, but beneath them, another line appeared. Yet it was by your order that he was given to be crucified. Pilate stumbled backward. His own sentence had sealed him. The silence pressed in, unforgiving, final. He looked at the Nazarene. Still, no anger, no accusation, only that same gaze, that knowing. And suddenly the truth crushed him. It had never been the crowd, never the priests. It had been him, his hands, his words, his choice. And now his judgment. Pilate fell to his knees. The throne glowed brighter. The scroll burned hotter. Then the voice from the throne spoke once more. Let the sentence be given. A great trembling shook the hall, and Pilate knew there would be no more appeals. A crack split the silence. Pilate's breath caught. The floor beneath him trembled. The hall shuddered, as if the foundations of existence were breaking apart. Then the scroll vanished. The throne darkened. The light recoiled. And a terrible realization struck Pilate. The judgment had been given. No, he whispered. But the ground collapsed beneath him. Pilate plunged. A scream tore from his throat, but it was lost in the endless abyss. Darkness rushed up to meet him. Wind roared past his ears. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. Then he hit the ground. The impact ripped the breath from his lungs. For a moment, there was silence. Then he opened his eyes, and he saw where he had fallen. The sky above was black as oil. The air reeked of decay, and stretching before him, an endless wasteland, a land of shadow, of wailing voices, of the condemned. Pilate staggered to his feet, his knees weak. Distant figures moved in the gloom, wandering, lost. Some wept, some screamed. And as Pilate turned, he saw them, the men he had sentenced, the thieves, the rebels, the damned. And they saw him. Their eyes burned with recognition, and they began to move toward him. Pilate turned to run, but there was nowhere to go, and from the shadows, a voice whispered, "You judged others, Pilatus. Now, judgment finds you." Pilate ran. His breath came in ragged gasps. His feet pounded against the barren ground, kicking up blackened dust. The figures followed. The thieves, the rebels, the damned. Their eyes burned with something unnatural. Their hands reached for him, clawing, grasping. "Pilatus!" they wailed. "Judge of Rome! Judge of men! Where is your judgment now?" Pilate stumbled, fell. The ground was searing hot. Smoke curled from cracks in the earth, rising in twisted, writhing shapes. Then a new sound. Not voices. Water. No, not water. Pilate turned towards the sound, his body trembling. A river stretched before him, but it was not like any river of Rome or Gaul or Judea. It glowed. The currents ran thick and molten, twisting like serpents of fire. and from the depths faces rose. Pilate gasped. Men and women screaming, writhing, reaching, they were drowning, but not in water, in flames. Pilate staggered backward. Then a figure emerged from the river. A man, cloaked in shadow, face unseen, but Pilate knew him, a centurion, one of his own. "You sentenced me to the cross, prefect," the voice rasped. "Now," the figure stepped forward, eyes hollow, burning. "You walk the road you paved." The fire reflected in Pilate's eyes, and the ground beneath his feet began to crack. The ground split apart. Pilate stumbled, his breath ragged. Beneath his feet, the earth crumbled into fire. The centurion took another step forward. "You passed judgment, Pilatus. Now judgment follows you." Pilate turned to run, but the wasteland had changed. The endless desert was gone. Now a city loomed before him, but not Jerusalem, not Gaul, not the cities of men. It was Rome, or what was left of it. The streets were cracked and broken. The columns crumbled. Statues of Caesar and Jupiter lay shattered in the dust. And the great eagle of Rome. It had fallen. Pilate's pulse hammered. Smoke curled through the ruins. Shadows moved in the broken streets. Figures weeping, wandering, wailing. Legionaries, senators, emperors, men of power, of conquest. Pilate knew their faces. He had stood beside them, served them, feared them. Now, they stood as nothing. A voice rose from the ruins. "You built an empire of stone. Yet here, there is no Rome." Pilate turned. From the shadows, another figure emerged. A man with a crown of gold, yet his robes were burned to ash. His face was twisted in agony. Pilate's chest tightened. "Tiberius," he whispered. The dead emperor looked upon him, and from his lips a single trembling whisper. "We were wrong." The ground quaked, the sky darkened, and the ruins of Rome began to collapse. The ruins of Rome crumbled. A great wind howled, tearing through the broken city, carrying the voices of the dead. Pilate covered his ears. The wailing, it was everywhere. The senators, the generals, the emperors, all of them lost. "We were wrong. We were wrong." The wind thickened into darkness, and when it cleared, he was no longer in the city. He stood in a vast chamber, a hall with no walls, no doors, only mirrors. Endless towering mirrors. Pilate's breath hitched. His reflection surrounded him, but something was wrong. The faces in the glass were not his. They were versions of him. A younger Pilate, smug with power. A Pilate in the praetorium washing his hands. A Pilate watching the Nazarene being led to the cross. And worse, a Pilate standing at the throne of judgment. His face was pale, trembling, his own eyes looking back at him in horror. Pilate stepped back, his hands shaking. The reflections did not move. Then, one of them spoke. "You are judged by the only one who sees you fully." The mirrors began to crack. Pilate turned to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. The mirrors shattered. Pilate flinched, covering his face as shards exploded around him. But instead of falling, they hung in the air. Each fragment still held his reflection, 1,000 versions of himself, frozen in terror. Then, from the darkness, a new sound rose, a sound he knew too well. The pounding of hammers, the echo of wood against nails. Pilate's breath caught in his throat. He turned and saw the crosses, endless, stretching into the blackened horizon. Some were empty, but many, many were not. Figures hung from them, writhing, moaning. Pilate's stomach twisted. He knew these men. They were those he had sentenced, the thieves, the zealots, the nameless rebels he had condemned to the cross. And then, one of them turned his head. A man twisted with agony, his eyes burning through the darkness. Pilate recognized him immediately, a nameless Jew, one of hundreds, one of thousands, condemned with a word. The man's lips curled into a smile. "Prefect," he rasped, "we've been waiting for you." The earth trembled, the crosses creaked, and Pilate suddenly knew they were making room for one more. The crosses loomed over him. The sky was black, suffocating, the air thick with whispers of the condemned. Pilate staggered backward, his breath shallow, uneven. "Prefect," the crucified man sneered. "You gave us judgment. Now," he grinned through cracked lips, "judgment is given to you." The earth split open. Pilate fell. Darkness swallowed him. He tumbled into the abyss, weightless, sinking through a void without end. Then, he stopped. The air was still. He stood in a new hall, but this one was not like the first. The throne was gone, the scroll was missing, and instead a man stood before him. Not the Nazarene, not the emperors of Rome, a figure cloaked in shadow. Pilate's chest tightened. "Who are you?" he whispered. The figure did not answer. Then the shadows parted, and Pilate saw his own face, his own eyes staring back at him. But in them, there was nothing. No power, no judgment, only emptiness. And then, the final voice spoke. "Now, Pilatus, you will judge yourself." Pilate stared at himself. The figure before him, his own reflection. But this Pilate was different. His face was hollow, his eyes void of light. "You passed judgment," the reflection whispered. "Now you stand before your own." Pilate's throat tightened. "What does that mean?" he rasped. The reflection tilted its head. "You have judged thousands. You sentenced the innocent and the guilty. Now, prefect of Judea, speak your own fate." Pilate's hands trembled. He stopped. His mind raced, tried to find an answer, but there was none. His life had already been written. The Nazarene's eyes still haunted him. The voices of the condemned still whispered. His hands, they still felt unclean. And then the question came, do you seek justice? Or do you seek mercy? Pilate's chest tightened. Justice or mercy? His whole life had been spent enforcing the first, but never had he begged for the second. His lips quivered, his breath hitched, and then he spoke, the moment the words left his mouth. The final judgment fell, the moment the words left Pilate's lips. The hall collapsed, the mirrors shattered into dust, the shadows recoiled, screaming, and the reflection, it vanished. Pilate fell to his knees. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own words. He had spoken them as a judge. Now he spoke them as the judged. A wind rose from the abyss. It carried the whispers of all he had condemned. "You will see me again." The voice, the Nazarene's voice, echoed one last time. And then, silence. The ground beneath Pilate split apart. The darkness swallowed him whole. He tumbled down into the void, falling endlessly. No throne, no trial, no second chance. Only the weight of his own judgment. And thus, Pilate disappeared. Lost, forgotten, erased from the records of Rome. Yet his name, his choice, his fate would be remembered forever. For the one he had condemned had risen, and his kingdom would never fall.